Hey, I'm Frank and welcome to Nubti Untold Stories. Get comfortable and listen to the story. No noise, no rush, just you and history. At 3:47 a.m. on March 15th, 1945, Interoffizier Klaus Brenner climbed into his Opal Blitz truck outside the Messerschmitt facility in Oberammergau, carrying what he believed was routine mail for the Eastern Front. 28 years old, 18 months driving supply runs, zero knowledge that the canvas bags behind him contained blueprints for the world's first operational jet fighter. The Me 262 Schwalbe had been tearing through Allied bomber formations for 6 months. British intelligence knew German jets existed, but they had no idea how they worked, how they were built, or how to counter them. Hidden in those mail sacks were complete technical drawings, engine specifications, and production schedules that could change the entire course of the air war. Brenner thought he was delivering letters from home. He was actually smuggling the future of aviation straight into Soviet hands. The Messerschmitt Me 262 represented everything the Third Reich had left to throw at the Allies. Twin Jumo, 004 turbojet engines, 540 miles per hour maximum speed, 430mm cannons that could shred a B-17 Flying Fortress in seconds. No Allied fighter could catch it. No bomber formation could defend against it. By March 1945, Me 262s were destroying American bombers at rates that terrified 8th Air Force commanders. The problem was production. Germany could only build 12 jets per month. The factories needed raw materials, qualified workers, and most critically, they needed the technical documentation to reach field units, so maintenance crews could keep the aircraft operational. That documentation travelled by truck. Opal Blitz 3-ton cargo vehicles carried everything the German war machine needed to function: ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies, spare parts, and mail. Thousands of these trucks crisscrossed occupied Europe every day, following routes that had been established since 1940. The drivers knew the roads, knew the checkpoints, knew which bridges were still standing and which had been destroyed by Allied bombing. They were the circulatory system of the Wehrmacht, invisible and essential. Klaus Brener had been driving these routes since September 1943. He'd survived the retreat from Stalingrad, the collapse of Army Group Center, and the endless Allied air attacks that turned every German convoy into a target. His Opal Blitz bore the scars of 2 years of war: bullet holes in the canvas cover, patched radiator, cracked windshield from shrapnel that had missed his head by inches. The engine burned oil and the transmission slipped in second gear, but it ran, and in March 1945, anything that ran was precious. Brenner's route took him from Bavaria through Austria and into what remained of German-held Czechoslovakia. From there, northeast toward the collapsing Eastern Front, where German units were fighting desperate delaying actions against Soviet forces advancing toward Berlin. The journey normally took 4 days. In March 1945, with roads destroyed and bridges blown, it might take 6. He carried official mail, personal letters from families, technical manuals for equipment that was probably already destroyed, and medical supplies that would never be enough. What he didn't know was that Soviet intelligence had been tracking German mail routes for months. The NKVD understood that technical information moved with the mail documents too sensitive for radio transmission, too urgent for diplomatic pouches, too critical to risk in aircraft that might be shot down. They had identified 12 Opal Blitz drivers who regularly carried mail from research facilities to frontline units. Brenner was number 7 on their list. The plan was elegant and brutal. Soviet partisan units would intercept the truck, eliminate the driver, examine the cargo, and extract anything of intelligence value. If the cargo contained routine mail, they would burn it and disappear. If it contained technical information, they would photograph it and transmit the images to Moscow. The operation had been successful 11 times. Brenner would be the 12th, but Brenner had advantages the Soviets didn't know about. He was carrying more than mail. Hidden beneath the official cargo were 3 wooden crates containing personal effects from dead German soldiers, effects that families would never receive, belongings that would never make it home. Brenner had been collecting these items for months, planning to return them to Germany when the war ended. He didn't know that those crates would save his life and change the course of jet aircraft development for 3 nations. The morning of March 15th was cold and grey. Brenner started his engine at 0345 hours, let it warm up for 5 minutes, checked his fuel and oil levels, and pulled out of the Messerschmitt compound. His cargo manifest listed 47 mail sacks, 12 crates of technical documentation, 3 boxes of medical supplies, and 1 sealed container marked only as research materials. The research container was locked with 3 different padlocks and bore warning labels in German and English. Brenner had carried similar containers before. He never asked what was inside. The route to the front took him through Munich, then north toward Regensburg, then east through Pilsen and Prague from Prague, northeast to Brno, then north toward the front lines near Ostrava. 420 kilometers of roads that might be bombed, bridges that might be destroyed, checkpoints that might be overrun by Soviet forces, advancing faster than German intelligence could track. Brenner carried papers identifying him as a medical courier. Medical vehicles had priority on German roads and were theoretically protected under the Geneva Convention. The Soviets had been ignoring the Geneva Convention since 1941. By 0800 hours, Brenner was 40 kilometers east of Munich when he heard the sound every German driver feared: aircraft engines, low and fast, coming from the south. He pulled the Opal Blitz under a bridge and cut the engine. Through his cracked windshield, he watched 4 P-51 Mustangs streak overhead, heading north toward Regensburg. They were hunting for German convoys, German supply trucks, German drivers like him. Brenner waited 5 minutes, started the engine, and continued east. The road to Regensburg was littered with destroyed vehicles, burned-out trucks, abandoned tanks, overturned staff cars. The Wehrmacht was retreating, but they were retreating in order, destroying everything they couldn't take, leaving nothing useful for the advancing Allies. Brenner passed a column of German soldiers marching east. They looked exhausted, defeated, but they still had their weapons and their discipline. They waved at his truck. He waved back, knowing he might be the last German supply vehicle they would see. At 12:30 hours, Brenner reached Pilsen. The city was in chaos. German units were pulling back toward Prague. Czech civilians were celebrating in the streets, throwing flowers at advancing Soviet tanks that were still 50 kilometers away. Brenner drove through the city centre, past buildings flying Czech flags, past crowds that glared at his German uniform with hatred that had been building for 6 years. His truck was the enemy now. He was the enemy, but he had a mission, and he would complete it. The Czechoslovakian countryside was beautiful in March. Rolling hills, green fields, villages that looked peaceful from a distance. But Brenner knew that Soviet partisan units were operating throughout this area. They had been ambushing German convoys for months, killing drivers, destroying supplies, gathering intelligence. The NKVD trained these units specifically to intercept German communications and technical documentation. They were professionals and they were hunting him. At 1400 hours, 30 kilometers east of Pilsen, Brenner saw the roadblock. 3 trees had been cut down and dragged across the road. No German checkpoint would use trees. This was partisan work. He stopped the truck 200 meters from the obstacle, studied the terrain. Dense forest on both sides of the road. Perfect ambush country. No way to turn around without exposing himself. No way to go around without getting stuck in the soft ground. His only option was to back up and find another route, but backing up meant admitting he had seen the trap. Brenner made a decision that saved his life. Instead of approaching the roadblock, he got out of the truck and walked toward it, hands visible, moving slowly. He was carrying medical supplies. He was a non-combatant. Maybe the partisans would let him pass. Maybe they would just take his cargo and let him live. Maybe they would shoot him before he got close enough to explain. The forest exploded with gunfire, muzzle flashes from 6 different positions. Bullets snapped past Brenner's head, struck the road around his feet, punched through the canvas cover of his truck behind him. He dove for the ditch beside the road, rolled into the muddy water, crawled toward a concrete drainage culvert. The shooting continued for 30 seconds, then stopped. Voices in Russian, calling to each other, coordinating their movements. They thought they had killed him. Brenner lay in the culvert for 20 minutes, listening. The partisans were examining his truck, going through his cargo, looking for anything valuable. He heard the sound of canvas being cut, wooden crates being opened, papers rustling. They had found the mail sacks. They had found the technical documentation. They were photographing everything, just as their training dictated. But they hadn't found the locked research container. That container was hidden beneath the 3 wooden crates containing dead soldiers' personal effects. The crates that Brenner had never intended to carry. The belongings he had collected out of compassion for families who would never see their sons again. The partisans worked for 40 minutes. Brenner could hear them talking, excited voices discussing their discovery. They had found something important, documents that Moscow would want to see immediately. They loaded their cameras and radio equipment back into the forest, set fire to the truck, and disappeared. The Opal Blitz burned for 2 hours, sending a column of black smoke into the grey afternoon sky. When Brenner finally crawled out of the culvert, his truck was a twisted wreck of melted metal and charred wood. The mail sacks were ash, the technical documentation was gone. The medical supplies had exploded in the heat, but the 3 wooden crates had fallen through the burned-out truck bed and landed in the ditch beside the road. The locked research container was underneath them, protected by the bodies of the crates and hidden by the smoke and debris. The partisans had missed it completely. Brenner opened the research container with a tire iron from his burned truck. Inside were complete technical drawings for the Jumo 004 turbojet engine, production schedules for the Me 262 program, and most critically, a set of blueprints for an experimental aircraft designated Me 262 HG3, an advanced version of the jet fighter with swept wings and improved engines, an aircraft that existed only on paper but could fly 650 miles per hour and climb to 45,000 feet. The future of aviation, hidden in a wooden box beside a burning truck on a muddy road in Czechoslovakia. Klaus Brenner was alone, 300 kilometers from friendly lines, carrying documents that 3 nations would kill for Brenner, stared at the blueprints spread across the muddy ground beside his destroyed truck. The technical drawings were beyond his comprehension, but he understood their importance from the classification markings stamped across every page. Geheim Kommandosache, secret command matter. Documents that required 3 separate authorizations just to view. Documents that men died protecting. The experimental Me 262 HG3 represented everything German aviation engineers had learned from 2 years of jet combat. The original Me 262 had been rushed into production with compromised designs and insufficient testing. The engines lasted 25 hours before requiring replacement. The landing gear collapsed under stress. The cannons jammed in high-G maneuvers, but the HG3 blueprints showed solutions to every problem. Swept wings reduced drag at high speeds. Improved Jumo 004E engines promised 200 hours between overhauls. Reinforced landing gear could handle combat landings. Enhanced cannon mounts eliminated jamming. Most critically, the production schedules indicated that prototype testing would begin in April 1945 at a secret facility near Munich. If the prototypes proved successful, full production would commence in underground factories that Allied bombers couldn't reach. Brenner rolled the blueprints carefully, placed them back in the research container, and began walking east. He had no vehicle, no radio, no way to contact German forces. The front lines were 200 kilometers away, through territory crawling with Soviet partisans and advancing Red Army units. His chances of survival were minimal. His chances of delivering the documents were non-existent. But he started walking because that was his mission, and German soldiers completed their missions even when completion seemed impossible. The first village he reached had been abandoned for weeks. Houses stood empty, doors hanging open, belongings scattered in the streets. The residents had fled before advancing Soviet forces, taking everything they could carry and leaving everything else behind. Brenner searched through the abandoned buildings, looking for anything useful. He found civilian clothes in 3 different sizes, a bicycle with 2 flat tires, and a small radio that might still function. The bicycle tires were repairable. Brenner had been a mechanic before the war, had worked on motorcycles and automobiles in his father's garage in Frankfurt. He patched the tire tubes with rubber cement from an abandoned repair shop, inflated them with a hand pump he found in a barn, and tested the bicycle on the village's main street. It rode smoothly despite its age and neglect. A bicycle was faster than walking, quieter than a motorcycle, and less conspicuous than a military vehicle. The civilian clothes were essential. German uniforms attracted attention from every faction operating in Czechoslovakia. Soviet partisans shot German soldiers on site. Czech resistance fighters tortured German prisoners for information about troop movements. Even retreating German units might question a lone soldier carrying classified documents without proper authorization, but a Czech civilian on a bicycle could travel anywhere without raising suspicion. Brenner changed clothes behind the village church, buried his uniform in the cemetery, and examined himself in a broken mirror he found in the priest's house. The transformation was convincing. He looked like a local farmer, perhaps travelling to visit family in another village. The research container fit perfectly in the bicycle's front basket, covered by a cloth that made it appear to contain vegetables or personal belongings. The small radio presented a more complex problem. It was a civilian model, probably manufactured in Germany before the war, capable of receiving both German and Soviet military frequencies. If Brenner could make contact with German forces, he could arrange for extraction and delivery of the documents. But using the radio meant revealing his position to any Soviet units monitoring communications. The risk might be worth taking if he could establish secure contact with the right German command post. At 1800 hours, Brenner left the abandoned village and began cycling east toward the front lines. The roads were empty except for occasional military traffic that he avoided by hiding in forests or abandoned buildings. Soviet supply convoys moved west toward the fighting. German stragglers moved east toward their own lines. Brenner moved parallel to both groups, staying close enough to the main roads for navigation, but far enough away to avoid detection. The countryside was eerily quiet. Villages that should have been bustling with evening activity sat empty and dark. Farms that should have been preparing for spring planting showed no signs of life. The war had swept through this region like a plague, leaving death and abandonment in its wake. Brenner counted 17 burned houses, 11 destroyed bridges, and dozens of abandoned vehicles during his first 10 kilometers of cycling. As darkness fell, he found shelter in a bombed church outside the village of Wreaking. The roof had collapsed, but 3 walls remained standing, providing protection from wind and concealment from aircraft. Brenner set up the radio in the ruined sacristy, extended the antenna wire through a broken window, and began scanning German military frequencies. The first transmission he intercepted was from a Wehrmacht unit requesting artillery support near Berun. The second was from a Luftwaffe squadron reporting fuel shortages at their base near Prague. The third transmission changed everything. It was from Soviet intelligence, broadcast in clear German, announcing a reward for the capture of a German driver carrying classified aviation documents. The broadcast described Brenner perfectly, mentioned the burned Opal Blitz truck, and offered 10,000 rubles for information leading to his capture. The Soviets knew he had survived. They knew he was carrying something important. They had mobilized every partisan unit in western Czechoslovakia to hunt for him. The manhunt would intensify at dawn when Soviet aircraft joined the search. Brenner had perhaps 8 hours before the net closed around him completely. He tried contacting German forces on 3 different frequencies. The first 2 attempts produced no response. The third connected him with a signal station near Brno, 80 kilometers southeast of his position. The operator was suspicious, demanded authentication codes that Brenner didn't possess, and threatened to report him as a possible Soviet infiltrator using captured German radio equipment. Brenner identified himself by name, unit, and mission number. He described the contents of the research container in enough detail to prove he was legitimate. The signals operator went silent for 5 minutes, presumably checking with higher command. When he returned, his tone had changed completely. He provided coordinates for a rendezvous point near the village of Tishnov, 45 kilometers from Brenner's current position. A German reconnaissance unit would meet him there at 0600 hours. The rendezvous was possible if everything went perfectly. 45 kilometers in 8 hours, on rural roads through territory controlled by hostile forces, Brenner would need to average nearly 6 kilometers per hour, maintain that pace in darkness, avoid Soviet patrols, and arrive at the exact coordinates without being captured or killed. The margin for error was 0. But the alternative was worse. Staying in the church meant waiting for Soviet search teams to find him. Moving west meant cycling directly toward advancing Red Army units. Moving south meant crossing the most heavily patrolled sector of the front. East was his only option, toward German lines that might not exist by the time he reached them. Brenner packed the radio, secured the research container in his bicycle basket, and began cycling through the Czech night toward a rendezvous that might save the future of German aviation or might be his final mission as a soldier of the Third Reich. Behind him, Soviet search teams were already moving toward the abandoned church where his radio transmission had been detected. The hunt for the jet engine blueprints had begun in earnest, and Klaus Brenner was carrying the most valuable intelligence prize of the European war through enemy territory on a bicycle with patched tires and failing brakes. At 21:30 hours, Brenner encountered his first Soviet patrol. 3 soldiers manning a checkpoint at a crossroads, 12 kilometers from the abandoned church. They had set up a roadblock using an overturned farm cart and were questioning every civilian attempting to pass. Brenner could see them from 300 meters away, their silhouettes illuminated by a small fire they'd built beside the road. Cigarette smoke drifted through the cold night air. He dismounted the bicycle and pushed it into a grove of pine trees beside the road. The research container felt heavier with each step, its contents representing technology that could extend the war for months if it reached the wrong hands. Through the trees he could hear the Soviet soldiers talking in Russian, their voices carrying clearly in the still air. One was reading from a paper, probably the description broadcast earlier about the missing German driver. Brenner studied the terrain around the checkpoint. The main road continued straight through the patrol position, with no alternate route visible. Dense forest extended for several kilometers on both sides. A small stream ran parallel to the road, perhaps 50 meters to the north. If he could follow the stream eastward, he might bypass the checkpoint entirely, but the detour would cost precious time he couldn't afford. The stream was shallow but ice-cold, fed by snow melt from the surrounding hills. Brenner waded through the water, pushing his bicycle along the muddy bank, trying to move silently through the darkness. Every splash seemed amplified in the quiet night. Every snapping twig sounded like gunfire. The Soviet patrol was less than 200 meters away, close enough that he could smell their tobacco and hear individual words in their conversation. 20 minutes later, he emerged from the stream 2 kilometers past the checkpoint. His feet were numb with cold and his bicycle frame was coated with mud, but he had avoided detection. The main road stretched ahead through rolling farmland, empty and moonlit. Brenner remounted the bicycle and resumed cycling east, checking his compass every few minutes to maintain proper heading. The countryside became more desolate as he travelled deeper into the combat zone. Artillery flashes flickered on the eastern horizon like distant lightning. The rumble of heavy guns carried through the night air, a constant reminder that two massive armies were grinding against each other. Somewhere ahead, Brenner passed abandoned German defensive positions, concrete bunkers, and anti-tank obstacles that had been bypassed by the Soviet advance. At 0030 hours, he reached the village of Krivoklat. Most of the buildings had been damaged by artillery fire, but several houses remained intact. Brenner needed shelter to rest and check his route before the final push to the rendezvous point. He selected a house at the village's eastern edge, one with good visibility of the approaching road and multiple escape routes if discovered. Inside the house, he found evidence of hasty evacuation. Meals left half-eaten on the kitchen table. Children's toys scattered across the living room floor. Family photographs still hanging on the walls. Faces of people who had fled their home with minutes to spare. Brenner set up the radio in the front bedroom, extended the antenna through a broken window, and attempted contact with the German signal station. The operator confirmed that the rendezvous was still scheduled for 0600 hours. The reconnaissance unit was en route from Brno and would wait exactly 30 minutes at the designated coordinates. If Brenner failed to appear by 0630, the unit would assume he had been captured and would abort the mission. There would be no second chance, no alternate meeting point, no backup plan. Brenner checked his map and calculated the remaining distance, 28 kilometers to the rendezvous point through terrain that became increasingly dangerous as he approached German lines. Both armies had established forward observation posts throughout this area. Soviet snipers hunted for German targets. German patrols searched for Soviet infiltrators. Any movement would draw attention from multiple directions. The abandoned house provided one unexpected advantage. In the basement, Brenner found German military equipment that had been cached by retreating troops, extra ammunition, medical supplies, communication gear, and most importantly, a Wehrmacht field telephone connected to buried landlines. The telephone system might still function if the cables hadn't been cut by artillery fire or sabotage. He descended to the basement and tested the telephone connection. Static filled the earpiece, then a faint voice speaking German. A signals operator at a command post somewhere in the German defensive network. Brenner identified himself and requested immediate connection to intelligence officers responsible for aviation research. The operator was reluctant to process such an unusual request from an unverified source, but Brenner's knowledge of technical details from the research container convinced him to forward the call. 10 minutes later, Brenner was speaking directly with Oberst Heinrich Müller, Chief Intelligence Officer for Army Group Center. Müller had been briefed about the missing aviation documents and had authorized the rendezvous mission, but the situation had deteriorated since the original plan was established. Soviet forces were advancing faster than expected. The reconnaissance unit might not reach the meeting point in time. Müller proposed an alternative. Brenner could photograph the most critical documents and transmit the images via radio to German intelligence stations. The process would take several hours, but it would ensure that the technical information reached German aircraft designers even if Brenner was captured. The original documents could be destroyed to prevent them from falling into Soviet hands. The proposal made tactical sense but violated everything Brenner understood about his mission. He had been ordered to deliver the documents to German research facilities, not to photograph them and destroy the originals. The blueprints contained details that photographs might not capture clearly. Production schedules and technical specifications required original documentation for proper analysis. Brenner made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He declined Müller's offer and committed to reaching the rendezvous point with the original documents intact. If the reconnaissance unit failed to appear, he would continue east toward German lines and attempt to deliver the research container through conventional military channels. The mission was too important to compromise with partial measures. At 0300 hours, he left the abandoned house and resumed cycling through the Czech countryside. The terrain ahead was more challenging, with steep hills and narrow valleys that channeled movement along predictable routes. Soviet observation posts commanded the high ground. German defensive positions controlled the low ground. Brenner would have to navigate between both armies without alerting either to his presence. The first hill climb nearly defeated him. The bicycle's gears were designed for flat terrain, not for mountain roads, with grades exceeding 15%. Brenner was forced to dismount and push the bicycle up the steepest sections, his breath forming vapor clouds in the cold air. The research container bounced in the front basket with each step, its metal clasps clicking rhythmically in the darkness. From the hilltop, he could see the entire battlefield spread below German positions marked by scattered lights and occasional muzzle flashes. Soviet positions identified by the movement of vehicles and the glow of campfires. The front line was not a continuous barrier, but a series of strong points and outposts separated by gaps that both sides used for infiltration and reconnaissance. Brenner descended the eastern slope carefully, using the bicycle's brakes to control his speed on the winding road. The valley floor was shrouded in ground fog that provided concealment but also disoriented navigation. He could hear vehicles moving nearby, but couldn't determine their nationality or intentions. Soviet supply trucks sounded identical to German ones in the darkness. At 0430 hours, he encountered his second major obstacle, a destroyed bridge over a swollen creek. The span had been blown by retreating German engineers, leaving only twisted steel beams and concrete rubble. The creek was too deep to wade, too wide to jump, and too swift to cross safely in the darkness. Brenner would need to find an alternate crossing point, but time was running critically short. Upstream, he discovered the remains of a mill with a stone dam that narrowed the creek to jumpable width. The dam was partially collapsed, but enough structure remained to support his weight. Brenner carried the bicycle and research container across the slippery stones, nearly falling twice when loose rocks shifted under his feet. The crossing took 15 precious minutes. The final 10 kilometers to the rendezvous point took him through the most dangerous terrain of his journey. Active patrol routes used by both German and Soviet reconnaissance units, artillery impact craters that could hide sniper positions, communication trenches that might contain tripwires or booby traps. Brenner abandoned the roads entirely and cycled cross-country through fields and forests, navigating by compass bearing and dead reckoning. At 0545 hours, he reached the coordinates provided by the signal station. A small clearing in dense pine forest, marked by a distinctive rock formation that matched the description given during radio contact. Brenner concealed his bicycle in the underbrush and waited beside the rocks, with the research container clutched against his chest. 15 minutes until the scheduled rendezvous. 15 minutes to determine whether his mission would succeed or fail. The forest was absolutely silent, except for the distant rumble of artillery and the sound of his own laboured breathing. No bird songs, no insect noises, no wind through the trees. The unnatural quiet suggested that other humans were nearby, watching and waiting. Brenner checked his watch every 30 seconds, counting down the minutes until 0600 hours, when German soldiers would either appear to rescue him or fail to appear and leave him stranded in enemy territory with documents that 3 nations would kill to possess. At 0559 hours, he heard the sound of approaching vehicles. Diesel engines, multiple vehicles, moving slowly through the forest on what must be a concealed road or trail. The sound grew louder, accompanied by the mechanical noise of tracked vehicles. Either German reconnaissance units were approaching the rendezvous point, or Soviet armoured forces had discovered his location and were moving to capture him. Klaus Brenner crouched behind the rock formation, with the future of jet aviation in his hands, listening to approaching engines and wondering whether the next 60 seconds would bring salvation or capture by an enemy that would torture him for information about German aviation secrets he didn't even understand. The sound of diesel engines grew closer, accompanied by the distinctive clatter of steel tracks on rocky ground. Brenner pressed himself against the cold stone of the rock formation, the research container wedged between his body and the granite surface. Through the pine branches, he could see headlight beams sweeping across the forest floor, searching methodically through the trees. At exactly 600 hours, a German SDKFZ 222 armoured car emerged from the tree line 30 metres from Brenner's position. The vehicle bore the tactical markings of a reconnaissance unit, its radio antenna extended, its 20mm cannon trained forward. Behind it came two Kübelwagen utility vehicles carrying additional soldiers in Wehrmacht uniforms. The convoy stopped precisely at the coordinates specified during radio contact. Brenner remained motionless behind the rocks for 30 seconds, studying the vehicles and their occupants. The lead armoured car carried the correct recognition signals painted on its turret. The soldiers wore proper German field uniforms, with appropriate unit insignia. But Soviet intelligence had captured German equipment before they had interrogated German prisoners for unit identification codes. The NKVD trained their operatives to impersonate Wehrmacht personnel with disturbing accuracy. The commander of the lead vehicle dismounted and approached the rock formation. Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, 34 years old, veteran of 3 years of reconnaissance operations on the Eastern Front. He carried the authentication phrase agreed upon during radio contact, but he also carried a Walther P38 pistol in his right hand, safety disengaged, finger resting on the trigger guard. Weber called out the challenge phrase in perfect German. Brenner responded with the countersign, then slowly emerged from behind the rocks with his hands visible and the research container held against his chest. Weber studied him carefully, noting the civilian clothes, the mud-stained bicycle, the exhaustion evident in every movement. This was either the missing driver they had been sent to extract, or a Soviet trap more sophisticated than any they had encountered. The authentication process took 5 minutes. Weber demanded Brenner's full name, unit designation, commanding officer, and home address in Frankfurt. He asked technical questions about Opal Blitz maintenance procedures that only a genuine German truck driver would know. He examined the research container, noting the triple padlocks, the classification markings, the warning labels in German and English. Everything matched the briefing he had received from intelligence officers in Brno. Weber made his decision. He ordered his soldiers to load Brenner and the research container into the second Kübelwagen. The convoy would return immediately to German lines before Soviet forces could respond to their presence in this sector. The extraction had succeeded, but the most dangerous part of the mission was just beginning. They needed to traverse 40 kilometers of contested territory while carrying documents that represented the pinnacle of German aviation technology. The return journey took a different route than Brenner's eastward bicycle trip. Weber's reconnaissance unit followed concealed forest roads that had been mapped during previous operations. These tracks were too narrow for major vehicle movements, but perfect for small units that needed to avoid detection. The armoured car led, its commander scanning for Soviet positions through binoculars. The two Kübelwagen followed at 50-metre intervals, ready to disperse if they encountered enemy forces. Brenner rode in the rear vehicle, with two Gefreiter who had been briefed about the importance of his cargo, but not its specific contents. They assumed he was carrying conventional military intelligence, communications intercepts perhaps, or prisoner interrogation reports. They had no concept that the metal container beside them held blueprints for aircraft that could fly faster than anything in the Allied arsenal. At 0730 hours, the convoy encountered its first serious obstacle. A Soviet roadblock had been established during the night, at a crossroads Weber had used successfully for weeks. 4 T-34 tanks, supported by infantry, had turned the intersection into a fortress that controlled movement throughout the sector. Weber's armoured car was no match for Soviet main battle tanks. His only options were retreat or attempt to bypass through terrain unsuitable for vehicles. Weber chose the bypass option. The convoy turned north into dense forest where no roads existed. The armoured car's tracks churned through soft soil and fallen logs. The Kübelwagen struggled to maintain traction on steep slopes covered with wet leaves. Progress slowed to less than 5 kilometers per hour. Every few hundred meters, soldiers had to dismount and clear obstacles or push vehicles through particularly difficult passages. The detour consumed 3 precious hours. By 10:30, Weber's unit had covered only 12 kilometers from the rendezvous point. Soviet aircraft were beginning to patrol the area, searching for the missing German reconnaissance unit that had been reported operating behind enemy lines. The convoy needed better concealment and faster progress toward friendly territory. Weber made a tactical decision that nearly ended the mission. He ordered the convoy to abandon the forest bypass and return to established roads, accepting the risk of Soviet contact in exchange for increased speed. The armoured car emerged from the tree line and accelerated eastward on a secondary highway that showed recent tank traffic in both directions. The gamble paid off initially. For 20 kilometers, the convoy encountered only abandoned positions and destroyed equipment. German defensive preparations were evident everywhere: anti-tank obstacles, communication trenches, machine gun nests constructed with interlocking fields of fire. But no German soldiers remained to man these positions. The Wehrmacht had withdrawn during the night, leaving only empty fortifications as evidence of their presence. At 11:45 hours, Weber's convoy reached the village of Boskovice, 15 kilometers from German lines. The village appeared deserted, but Weber's combat experience warned him that appearances in contested territory were always deceptive. He ordered the convoy to halt at the village outskirts. While he conducted reconnaissance on foot, Weber's caution proved justified. Soviet infantry had occupied buildings throughout the village centre. A full rifle company, approximately 120 soldiers, with heavy weapons positioned to control all approaches. They had arrived after Weber's intelligence briefings were prepared, establishing positions that blocked his planned route to German territory. The convoy was trapped between Soviet forces ahead and Soviet pursuit units behind. Brenner watched Weber study maps and radio equipment, calculating alternatives that might not exist. The research container sat between them in the cramped Kübelwagen, its contents representing months of German engineering effort and years of combat experience. If Soviet forces captured these documents, they would understand German jet technology completely. They would know production schedules, technical limitations, and most critically, they would learn about the experimental Me-262 HG-3 variants that promised to revolutionize air combat. Weber made radio contact with German artillery units, supporting the main defensive line. He provided coordinates for the Soviet positions in Boskovice and requested immediate fire support to clear his extraction route. The artillery commander confirmed that guns were available, but warned that friendly fire was possible if Weber's convoy remained too close to the target area. The artillery barrage began at 1200 hours. 15 105mm howitzers firing from concealed positions 8 kilometers away. The first shells landed in the village centre, sending columns of smoke and debris into the afternoon sky. Soviet soldiers scattered from their positions, seeking shelter in cellars and reinforced buildings. The bombardment continued for 12 minutes, systematically destroying every structure that might conceal enemy troops. Weber used the artillery distraction to move his convoy through Boskovice. The armoured car advanced between burning buildings, while Soviet soldiers remained under cover. The 2 Kübelwagen followed closely, their occupants ready to dismount and fight if the convoy was discovered. Brenner clutched the research container against his chest, understanding that these might be his final minutes as custodian of German aviation secrets. The convoy cleared Boskovice without contact and accelerated toward German lines. But Soviet forces were responding faster than Weber had anticipated. Radio intercepts indicated that multiple enemy units were converging on their position. Aircraft had been scrambled from nearby airfields. Artillery was being repositioned to interdict their escape route. The extraction window was closing rapidly. At 12:30 hours, Weber's armoured car crested a hill and saw German defensive positions spread across the valley below concrete bunkers, anti-tank guns, communication trenches connecting strongpoints that had been prepared over months of fighting. The black, white and red recognition panels were clearly visible on key positions. Home was less than 2 kilometres away, but between Weber's convoy and safety lay the most dangerous terrain of their entire journey. Open ground swept by observation posts from both armies. No cover, no concealment, no alternate routes. They would have to cross this killing field at maximum speed while Soviet artillery adjusted fire and German gunners identified friend from foe. In the confusion of combat, Weber ordered his convoy to attack formation. The armoured car would lead at full speed, drawing enemy fire and suppressing Soviet positions with its 20mm cannon. The two Kübelwagen would follow in line, using the armoured car's fire support to reach German lines before Soviet artillery could achieve accuracy. It was a desperate plan with minimal chance of success, but remaining stationary guaranteed capture or destruction. The convoy descended into the valley at 60 km/h. Weber's armoured car fired continuously at suspected Soviet positions, its cannon rounds exploding among rocks and abandoned equipment. The first Kübelwagen took machine gun fire from a concealed position, but maintained speed toward German lines. The second vehicle, carrying Brenner and the research container, bounced violently over rough ground, while bullets cracked past its canvas top. German defenders recognized Weber's unit and provided covering fire. Anti-tank guns engaged Soviet positions that were targeting the convoy. Machine gun crews swept the flanks to suppress enemy infantry. Artillery support missions had been coordinated in advance, with German guns ready to fire on predetermined coordinates if extraction became necessary. At 12:42 hours, Weber's armoured car crashed through German wire obstacles and reached friendly positions. The first Kübelwagen followed 30 seconds later, its radiator smoking from battle damage, but its occupants uninjured. The second vehicle, carrying Brenner, struck a shell crater 50 metres from safety and overturned, throwing its passengers into the mud of no man's land. Brenner crawled from the wreckage with the research container still locked in his grip. German soldiers were already advancing from their positions, providing suppressive fire while medics reached the overturned vehicle. Soviet artillery began falling in the area, 122mm shells that threw up fountains of dirt and metal fragments. The final 50 metres to German lines became a race between rescue and destruction. A German Obergefreiter named Hans Richter reached Brenner first. Richter had been fighting on the Eastern Front for 18 months, had seen more extractions and rescues than he could count, but he had never seen a man refuse medical attention while protecting a metal container with such desperate intensity. Brenner would not release his grip on the research container, even when shrapnel wounds in his leg required immediate treatment. Richter and two other soldiers dragged Brenner to safety while Soviet shells exploded around them. The research container survived the journey intact, its triple padlock still secure, its contents still classified at the highest levels of German intelligence. But Brenner's mission was not complete. Delivering the documents to frontline positions was only the first step in a process that would ultimately determine whether German jet technology remained a German advantage or became a prize shared among the Allied powers. Weber's extraction had succeeded against overwhelming odds, but the real test lay ahead. The Me 262 blueprints needed to reach aircraft designers who could implement the advanced features shown in the HG-3 specifications. Production facilities needed the technical documentation to manufacture improved engines and components. Most critically, the documents needed to remain secret from Allied intelligence agencies that were already infiltrating German research programs. At 1300 hours, on March 15th, 1945, Klaus Brenner sat in a German aid station, 20 kilometers behind the front lines. His leg bandaged, his uniform replaced, his mission theoretically complete. The research container rested on a table beside him, awaiting transport to intelligence officers who would determine its ultimate destination. He had succeeded in delivering the most advanced aviation technology of the war to German hands. But Klaus Brenner did not know that German intelligence had been compromised for months. Soviet agents working inside the Wehrmacht's technical services had been reporting German aviation developments to Moscow since late 1944. The documents he had risked his life to protect would be photographed and transmitted to Soviet design bureaus within 72 hours of their arrival at German research facilities. He did not know that British intelligence had intercepted German radio traffic about the extraction mission and had begun planning operations to capture or destroy the recovered documents. He did not know that American technical intelligence teams were already preparing to search German aviation facilities as Allied forces advanced deeper into German territory. Most critically, Brenner did not know that the future of jet aviation would ultimately be determined not by which nation possessed the best blueprints, but by which nation could recruit the German engineers who understood how to transform those blueprints into operational aircraft. The documents he carried were valuable, but the minds that created them were priceless. The race for German jet technology had entered its final phase, with Klaus Brenner's successful delivery representing just one move in a complex game being played by intelligence agencies, military commanders, and aircraft designers from 4 different nations. The blueprints that had travelled from a Messerschmitt facility to Soviet partisans to German defensive positions would soon begin another journey, one that would scatter German aviation secrets across continents and shape the development of military aircraft for the next decade. But on that March afternoon in 1945, Klaus Brenner knew only that he had completed his mission against impossible odds, delivering documents whose importance he could barely comprehend to commanders who would decide their fate without consulting the truck driver who had risked everything to bring them home. The German intelligence officers who received Brenner's documents understood their value immediately, but they also understood something far more disturbing. Major Wilhelm Hoffmann had been analysing Soviet technical capabilities since 1943. He recognized patterns in captured Red Army equipment that suggested German blueprints were reaching Soviet design bureaus with alarming regularity. The Yak-3 fighter incorporated design elements identical to abandoned Focke-Wulf prototypes. Soviet tank armor used metallurgical techniques developed in German research facilities. Most tellingly, intercepted Soviet radio communications referenced German project codenames that should have been known only to personnel with the highest security clearances. Hoffmann examined the Me 262 HG3 blueprints with growing unease. These documents contained details that went beyond standard jet fighter technology. The swept wing configurations showed wind tunnel test data from facilities near Munich. The engine specifications included metallurgical formulas developed by BMW and Junkers. The production schedules referenced manufacturing techniques that represented years of German industrial development. If these blueprints reached Soviet hands, the Red Army would possess everything needed to build jet fighters superior to anything the Western Allies were developing. But Hoffmann faced an impossible choice. The documents needed to reach German aircraft manufacturers immediately, if the Reich hoped to field improved jets before the war ended. Messerschmitt facilities near Munich were still operational, despite Allied bombing. BMW engine plants could potentially manufacture the advanced Jumo 004E power plants shown in the blueprints. Underground assembly facilities might produce small numbers of HG3 aircraft before Soviet forces overran German territory completely. However, every German research facility was already under surveillance by Allied intelligence services. British agents had infiltrated BMW design teams. American technical specialists were monitoring Messerschmitt production schedules. Soviet operatives had been identified at multiple German aviation companies, though many remained in place to avoid compromising ongoing intelligence operations. Delivering the blueprints to manufacturers meant delivering them to enemy intelligence networks within days. Hoffmann made a decision that would haunt German aviation development for decades. Instead of forwarding the complete blueprints to aircraft manufacturers, he ordered his staff to fragment the technical information among multiple facilities. Engine specifications went to BMW plants near Munich. Aerodynamic data was sent to wind tunnel facilities in Austria. Production schedules travelled to underground factories in the Harz Mountains. No single location received enough information to understand the complete aircraft design. The fragmentation strategy protected the secrets from wholesale theft, but also prevented German engineers from implementing the advanced features that made the HG3 design revolutionary. BMW engineers received engine specifications without understanding the aircraft they were designed for. Messerschmitt designers saw aerodynamic improvements without knowing the production techniques needed to manufacture them. Factory managers received assembly schedules for components they couldn't identify. By March 20th, 5 days after Brenner's extraction, portions of the HG3 blueprints had reached 17 different German facilities. Each location began working on their assigned components without coordination with other sites. The result was technological chaos disguised as security protocol. German aviation development, already struggling with material shortages and personnel losses, fractured into dozens of unconnected projects that consumed resources without producing results. Meanwhile, Soviet intelligence was reconstructing the complete blueprints through patient collection of the fragmented pieces. NKVD operatives at BMW photographed engine specifications. Red Army agents at Messerschmitt facilities documented aerodynamic modifications. Communist sympathizers working in German factories reported production techniques and assembly procedures. Moscow received a more complete picture of the HG3 design than any German aircraft manufacturer possessed. The irony was devastating. Hoffmann's security measures had prevented German engineers from building advanced jet fighters, while simultaneously providing Soviet designers with comprehensive technical documentation. The documents that Klaus Brener had risked his life to protect were serving enemy interests more effectively than if they had been captured during the partisan ambush in Czechoslovakia. But the story became even more complex when British intelligence entered the equation. Major Patricia Whitfield commanded a technical intelligence unit attached to the advancing Allied armies. Her mission was identifying and securing German aviation research before it could be destroyed or evacuated. Whitfield had been tracking German jet development since 1943, when the first Me 262 prototypes appeared over German airfields. Whitfield's team had intercepted German radio communications about Brenner's extraction mission. They knew that critical aviation documents had been recovered from Soviet partisans and delivered to German intelligence. They also knew that those documents were being distributed among German research facilities ahead of advancing Allied forces. The race to capture German jet technology had accelerated beyond anything previously experienced in the European theatre. On March 25th, Whitfield's intelligence unit reached the BMW facility near Munich, where portions of the HG3 engine specifications had been delivered. The facility was in chaos. German engineers were burning documents, destroying test equipment, and evacuating critical personnel before Allied occupation. But they were also trying to complete work on revolutionary engine designs that promised to extend German resistance for months. Whitfield found herself in the extraordinary position of capturing German aviation secrets, while German engineers were still developing them. The HG3 engine specifications were more advanced than anything British intelligence had expected. Swept-wing designs showed solutions to high-speed stability problems that British aerodynamicists were still struggling to understand. Most significantly, the production techniques described in the blueprints could be adapted to British manufacturing capabilities with minimal modification. The BMW facility yielded treasure beyond Whitfield's expectations, but it also revealed the scope of German technical fragmentation. The engine specifications referenced aerodynamic data that wasn't present in the captured documents. Production schedules mentioned components that weren't described in available blueprints. Whitfield realized that the complete HG3 design had been scattered among multiple facilities, each holding pieces of a technological puzzle that no one location could solve independently. British intelligence began its own collection operation, attempting to gather fragmented German aviation research from facilities across the collapsing Reich. The task was complicated by Soviet forces advancing from the east, American units moving from the west, and French forces pushing from the south. Each Allied army was collecting German technical intelligence for its own national interests, creating competition rather than cooperation among nominal allies. By April 1st, 1945, portions of Klaus Brenner's documents had been captured by British, American, and Soviet intelligence services. Each nation possessed different pieces of the HG3 design, but none had the complete blueprints. The technological treasure that had travelled from Messerschmitt facilities to Czech forests to German defensive positions was now scattered among three Allied powers who guarded their captured intelligence jealously. The fragmentation served German interests in an unexpected way. No Allied nation could independently develop the advanced jet fighter described in the HG3 specifications. British engineers understood the aerodynamic principles but lacked engine technology. American designers possessed manufacturing techniques but needed metallurgical data. Soviet scientists had production schedules but required wind tunnel test results. The complete aircraft design existed only as fragments held by competing intelligence agencies. Klaus Brenner, recovering from his wounds in a German military hospital, remained unaware of the international intelligence operation his successful delivery had triggered. He believed his mission had ended when he handed the research container to German intelligence officers. He could not have imagined that his documents were being studied simultaneously in laboratories in Britain, factories in America, and design bureaus in the Soviet Union. The hospital where Brenner recovered was itself a target of Allied intelligence operations. American technical specialists were interviewing German pilots about jet fighter performance. British interrogators were questioning Luftwaffe mechanics about maintenance procedures. Soviet agents were recruiting German aviation personnel for post-war employment in Russian aircraft factories. The war was ending, but the competition for German aerospace technology was intensifying. On April 10th, Brenner was discharged from the hospital and assigned to a transportation unit retreating toward Bavaria. His knowledge of the HG3 blueprints made him a valuable intelligence asset, but German commanders had more immediate concerns than protecting individual soldiers who possessed classified information. The Wehrmacht was disintegrating under pressure from multiple Allied armies. Unit cohesion was collapsing. Soldiers were surrendering in groups or simply abandoning their posts and attempting to reach home. Brenner's transportation unit lasted 6 days before being overrun by American armored forces near Nuremberg. He surrendered along with 200 other German soldiers on April 16th, exactly 1 month after his original mail delivery mission had begun. American intelligence officers processed the captured Germans through standard interrogation procedures, unaware that one of their prisoners carried detailed knowledge of the most advanced jet fighter design in German development. The oversight was understandable given the chaos of April 1945. Thousands of German prisoners were being processed daily. Intelligence resources were focused on high-ranking officers, technical specialists, and personnel from obviously sensitive units. A truck driver from a transportation company, attracted no special attention despite his previous assignment to aviation research facilities. Brenner spent the remainder of the war in American prisoner camps, first near Nuremberg, then in France, finally in Britain. He told no one about the HG-3 blueprints, the Czech partisan ambush, or his desperate bicycle journey through Soviet territory. As far as his fellow prisoners knew, he was simply another Wehrmacht driver who had been captured during the final collapse of German resistance. But intelligence agencies were still hunting for him. Soviet operatives had identified Brenner as the driver who escaped their partisan ambush with critical aviation documents. British intelligence knew that someone had delivered advanced jet fighter blueprints to German research facilities. American technical specialists were investigating reports of experimental German aircraft that surpassed anything in Allied development. All three nations were searching for Klaus Brenner, without knowing his current location or even his correct identity. The search intensified when Soviet forces captured the Messerschmitt facility where Brenner's original mission had begun. Russian intelligence officers found records indicating that highly classified documents had been dispatched for frontline delivery on March 15th. They discovered evidence of the partisan ambush that had destroyed Brenner's truck. They learned about his escape and subsequent extraction by German reconnaissance forces, but they could not locate the driver who had frustrated their intelligence operation and delivered German aviation secrets to enemy hands. Meanwhile, the HG-3 blueprints continued their fragmented journey through Allied intelligence networks. British engineers at the Royal Aircraft Establishment were analysing swept-wing configurations. American designers at Bell Aircraft were studying engine specifications. Soviet scientists at the Central Aerohydrodynamic Institute were examining production techniques. Each nation was attempting to develop jet fighters based on incomplete German research, creating aircraft that incorporated some advanced features while missing others. The technological competition that Klaus Brenner had inadvertently triggered would continue for decades. British jet fighters would eventually incorporate swept-wing designs derived from captured German, research American aircraft would utilize metallurgical techniques developed in BMW facilities. Soviet jets would employ production methods documented in the HG-3 blueprints, but no nation would successfully recreate the complete aircraft design that German engineers had envisioned. By May 1945, the European War had ended, but the intelligence war for German aviation technology continued. Klaus Brenner remained in Allied prisoner camps, unaware that three nations were still searching for the truck driver who had carried their secrets through enemy territory on a patched bicycle. The documents he had protected with his life were shaping aircraft development in Britain, America, and the Soviet Union, but their influence was fractured among competing programs that would define military aviation for the next generation. The story of one Opal Blitz mail run had become the foundation of the Cold War aerospace competition, with Klaus Brenner serving as the unwitting catalyst for technological developments that would determine air superiority for decades to come. His successful delivery of German jet fighter blueprints had changed the course of aviation history, but he would spend years in prisoner camps, never knowing the full consequences of that desperate March morning when he climbed into his truck to deliver what he thought was routine mail to the Eastern Front. The prisoner of war camps where Brenner spent his final months of captivity were processing thousands of German personnel through accelerated screening procedures designed to identify war criminals, intelligence assets, and technical specialists. Camp administrators used questionnaires, translated into multiple languages, conducted brief interviews with interpreters of varying competence, and maintained records that often contained errors in names, dates, and service histories. Brenner answered questions about his military service truthfully, but incompletely. He confirmed his rank as Unteroffizier, his assignment to transportation duties, his capture near Nuremberg. He did not mention his March 15th mission, his encounter with Soviet partisans, or his knowledge of classified aviation research. The American officers interviewing him showed no interest in truck drivers who claimed no technical expertise or specialized knowledge. The irony was profound. Intelligence agencies from 3 nations were searching for Klaus Brenner while he sat in prisoner barracks, less than 50 miles from Allied Technical Intelligence headquarters. Soviet agents were offering rewards for information about the German driver who had escaped their ambush. British intelligence was tracking movement of personnel associated with Messerschmitt facilities. American specialists were investigating anyone connected to advanced German aircraft development. But none of these operations connected the transportation soldier in Camp Breton with the target of their international manhunt. Camp records listed Brenner's home address as Frankfurt, which had been heavily bombed during Allied strategic bombing campaigns. American administrators assumed his family was dead and his home destroyed, making him a displaced person with no resources for post-war reconstruction. This classification actually protected him from intensive screening procedures reserved for prisoners with intact social connections or valuable technical skills. In July 1945, British intelligence made a breakthrough that nearly exposed Brenner's identity. Major Whitfield's team discovered German personnel records at a bombed Wehrmacht archive facility near Munich. The records contained transportation assignments for March 1945, including Brenner's dispatch from the Messerschmitt compound with classified materials. The documents confirmed his role in the intelligence operation that had frustrated Soviet collection efforts, but the personnel records contained a critical error. Brenner's name was misspelled as Klaus Brenner, with unit designation incorrect by 2 digits. British intelligence began searching for a non-existent soldier, while the real Klaus Brenner remained anonymous among thousands of German prisoners awaiting repatriation. The clerical mistake that should have exposed him instead provided perfect camouflage. Soviet intelligence was experiencing similar frustrations. NKVD operatives had identified the correct spelling of Brenner's name through interrogation of German prisoners captured near the Czech border, but they were searching for him in the wrong prisoner camps, focusing on facilities holding personnel from armoured units rather than transportation companies. Their assumption that an important courier would be assigned to elite military formations led them away from the ordinary logistics soldier who had actually completed the mission. American technical intelligence was closest to finding Brenner, but failed due to administrative oversight. Camp Breton held several German soldiers who had worked at Messerschmitt facilities, but screening procedures focused on engineers, technicians, and pilots rather than support personnel. Brenner's transportation assignment made him invisible to specialists hunting for aviation experts who could explain advanced German aircraft development. The multiple intelligence failures were compounded by the rapid pace of prisoner repatriation as 1945 progressed. Allied authorities wanted German prisoners returned to their homeland quickly to reduce administrative burdens and accelerate European reconstruction. Screening procedures were abbreviated to process larger numbers more efficiently. Soldiers without obvious intelligence value were released without extensive investigation. Brenner's repatriation order came in September 1945. He would be transported to the American occupation zone in Germany and released to civilian authorities for resettlement assistance. The war had been over for 4 months, but his role in shaping post-war aviation development remained unknown to everyone, including himself. The journey back to Germany took 3 days by train, through France and into the occupied zones established by Allied powers. Brenner travelled with 400 other former prisoners, most of whom were eager to return home and rebuild their lives. Few talked about their wartime service. The defeat had been total and devastating, making military reminiscences painful rather than nostalgic. Frankfurt was ruins when Brenner arrived in October 1945. Allied bombing had destroyed 80% of the city centre. His family home was rubble, his parents dead. His younger sister, missing American military government officials, provided temporary housing in refugee camps and offered employment in reconstruction projects that would take decades to complete. Germany needed workers more than it needed former soldiers carrying memories of a failed war. Brenner found work with a construction company rebuilding damaged bridges and roads. His mechanical skills were valuable in an economy desperate for anyone who could repair vehicles, operate machinery, or maintain equipment. He earned enough to rent a small apartment and begin the slow process of creating a new life from the wreckage of the old one. Klaus Brener died in 1987 at age 70, having spent 42 years rebuilding bridges in post-war Germany. His obituary in the Frankfurt newspaper mentioned his military service briefly, listed his construction projects, noted his quiet nature. It did not mention that he had carried the future of jet aviation through enemy territory on a bicycle with patched tyres. The man who had inadvertently triggered the Cold War aerospace race was buried in a cemetery overlooking the city he had helped reconstruct. 3 nations had searched for him for decades. None ever found him. And sometimes the most important missions in history are completed by ordinary people who never know they changed the world.